I used to work for the radio service of the Christian Science Monitor, and you may remember that was a pretty strong paper that did a lot of good work, for instance, covering apartheid in South Africa. That was not my beat. But they had a rule, Fernand in particular. The rule was we could never end our stories on "we're all going to die." And you needed to present, even if you were kind of grasping at straws, some kind of policy way forward. You weren't to be Pollyanna. But given what we've heard earlier about India, that the United States has these strategic interests in we want to have a good relationship in our efforts to counter China, do you see a process forward to improve the protections and rights of minorities in India?
I would say yes. Despite everything, as you were saying earlier, there has, in fact, been a long history of peace, not conflict, between Hindus and Muslims and other minorities. And I think eventually that this is perhaps more ingrained in Indian society than we have seen with the current instrumentalization for political reasons of intolerance and fear towards minorities. I am hopeful that some of the better traditions, history, and peaceful coexistence in India can return to the surface. Eventually, I feel that there may also be enough pressure coming from international organizations to indicate that enough is enough, and there's no longer any wriggle room to try to avoid your legal obligations. Until now, India has been able to avoid, for example, that the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have a presence inside India. Just recently, the UN High Commissioner has actually been insisting and calling for India to allow it to be present on the ground. For the United States itself, I think it is for the longer term benefit of the United States to have a clear moral stand towards India and no longer give it too much leeway. India needs the United States. I would say as much, perhaps even more, that the US needs India. And therefore, if you are truly a good friend of India, you should not allow what is clearly unacceptable, even inhuman situations being conducted. It is time to actually be clear and firm and to have a moral approach if the US is to redeem itself in terms of its standing in the international community. And that means, for the State Department, for example, to recognize India as a country of concern, which is one of the recommendations of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. Take a step. Give the signals that there are limits to what the Indian government can do. Otherwise, the situation there may actually be one of greater instability. If in the interest of the United States, the interest of the US is to have a stable India, and currently the context that you have here, with atrocities being committed, with a significant proportion of the population being excluded and marginalized and threatened, that may actually lead to further instability, and in the end, that would be contrary to the longer-term interests of the US government. So to try to be positive is change is still possible within the tradition and history and culture of India. It is necessary to actually clearly say what needs to be done. We know that there is still a great, the media presence, there is still the press playing an extremely important role in India. There is still ground and space for civil society to play an extremely important role. We've seen it with some of the demonstrations from women and other groups against the citizenship laws that actually were against Muslim minorities. All of that to me says that there is much more involved. India is not a monolith, it's a mosaic, and there are forces there that can still work together. But we need also outside clarity and morality in the conduct towards India, and that especially means the United States.
Professor Singh, do you see routes forward?
I think my answer as a political scientist would be institutional in some ways. So I think, Fernand, you were absolutely right in pointing out this very problematic judgment by the Supreme Court in the context of the Ayodhya case. But I do want to point out that just in the last few weeks, the Supreme Court seems to be trying to find its backbone again. So it has had a very important judgment as regards electoral bonds. And so I think hope is a moral imperative. So I cling to hope less because I don't cling to it as an empiricist. Professor Varshney made this distinction between him and Professor Mehta as a normative political theorist and an empirical social scientist. And as an empirical social scientist, I actually am quite hopeless. But as a normative, it's also... But I think as it's almost like a moral duty to hope. But I think that where there is a silver lining is the Supreme Court doesn't seem to be dead. It has kind of instituted this very important judgment. And then I think the role of the opposition. I mean, it is certainly likely that the present regime will win the upcoming elections, but it is by no means a preordained conclusion. And I think the role of India's opposition parties, the extent to which they can come together and make an alliance, and also the Indian people, at least electorally, India is still very much a democracy. And so I think institutions and the Indian people, as much as it is the international community and the US, is where that kind of moral duty I would locate.
Emily, questions or comments?
Well, I mean, looking at the opposition, so in the news the other day, we learned that the Congress Party is claiming their funding has been frozen. Rahul Gandhi walked the length and breadth of India, hoping to generate some enthusiasm for himself and for the party. It doesn't seem to have worked. And there's just so much infighting, and there was a reference to that earlier, that on the left there's all sorts of division, whereas on the right there's a lot of cohesion. So, I mean, realistically, do you see the opposition coalescing in a meaningful way to present a challenge to the BJP in time for the general elections?
It's a great question, Emily, and I return to my point that as an empirical social scientist, as I said. But I do think, actually in the process of putting together this presentation and looking at that map of India, in which in state elections, there is still a significant part of India that is not yet saffron, which is the color of the ruling regime, was in some ways reassuring to me because it is easy to forget. And so I think I place my hopes actually in the states. I think at a national level, you perhaps are right in that the odds are low, the stakes are high, but the odds are low. There's a lot that needs to happen from now until whenever the elections happen. And certainly the one thing I want to mention is that the Ayodhya temple that you have heard so much about, the timing of it is very strategic, and it's very much in the context of the mobilization that is, it's part of the, even though elections haven't been announced yet, it's very much the run-up to the election. But I think in state elections, you still have a lot of non-BJP governments that are in power, strong female chief ministers, like, who have I'm not saying I endorse her, but, Mamta. And so a lot of India's regions still have, I think that's where the hope is, but I don't disagree with you in terms of your dismal assessment of the present state of the opposition.
We have some questions in the house. Let's go to the balcony on our left.
My name's Gavin, and I'm from Greenville, student from Greenville. And my question for you is, do you think that the violence against the religions and citizens of India, do you think it could lead to a revolt by those citizens and religions? And if there is, do you think it could lead to a societal collapse of India?
Dr. Singh, you had charts with heat maps of instability.
Those were Maoist insurgencies. It is certainly the case that India feels volatile. It feels a little unsafe, and it definitely, in the run-up, I was last in India last month, and it feels jagged. The capital feels jagged. It was also in just a few days before the inauguration of the temple. And so I'm not sure that I would be able to predict kind of societal level collapse in some ways. And so it is this paradox in which one way there is economic strength, economic resurgence, there is a sense of optimism and hope that is articulated by many in power. But on the other hand, there is, at least in a very palpable sense, on India's streets. I mean, as a woman in India, I've never felt safe on the street. There was I don't know, Emily, what your take on that would be, but I was reading an interview with a number of young Canadians, Indians who had come to Canada, and the whole internet was apparently making fun of this young woman from India because they asked her, what is your favorite thing about Canada? And she said, oh, I really love walking on the street. And the internet just kind of was like, oh my God, so ridiculous, woman's come from India, and she's like, oh, I just love walking on the street. But there's something deep, true, and powerful there. And I think that India is not becoming a safer place for women. It's just certainly not becoming a safer place for minorities. And I think in that, it is not becoming a safer place for whoever or whatever the majority is either, because peace is not zero-sum. By making others feel unsafe, you do not become safer yourself.
Back of the house.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Nick. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maine in Orono. Special Reporter Dave Varennes had kind of touched on civil society a little bit, but I had a question to dig a little bit further into that. For social issues like gender-based violence or the caste system, is there a robust and well-supported network of NGOs to advocate for these issues in India? And does the state afford civil society and non-state actors the capacity to generate genuine change in these endemic injustices through political activity?
Coupled with what we know from the panels about limits on NGOs, as we've learned, is there residual capacity, I guess is how I would rephrase that.
I just want to say, each time I go to India, so I mentioned about how it's jagged and unsafe, but it's also so deeply inspiring and moving to see, I think, exactly what you described so articulately in terms of the extent of resistance that you are seeing. So to answer your question very pointedly, yes, there are civil society organizations on the ground working with making those alliances which, I think Emily is rightly pointing out, are much more difficult to make at a political level. These NGOs are doing it, but they're doing it under increasingly dire circumstances. Again, I think Emily mentioned the kind of taking away of foreign funding, the shutting of institutions like the Center for Policy Research, which was an academic home for many of us here in the audience, as well as the cutting of foreign funding. Someone in the audience mentioned Harsh Mandar, who has been an amazing conscience of India. And so, they are, yes, they exist. They have been the heart and soul of India, going back to India's tradition of Gandhian civil disobedience, but they are under threat. And the work, and I think that just as Professor Mehta said, I'm not sure how much of this should happen at the country level, but as much support as India's civil society organizations, India's academic freedom is under serious threat in India. There are important, powerful voices, but they are being muffled, and I think it's important for us to be able to do what we can such that those voices can be heard.
And in the statistics data that I had earlier, the number of civil society organizations that have been shut down is actually quite astounding. And most of these, I think, is around 80% of these closed. We're talking about 16,000 civil society organizations have been closed down by the current Modi government through the Foreign Contributions Act. So it's becoming more and more a situation of repression in India, and it's becoming, therefore, more and more difficult for civil society organizations to be active and audible and visible on the ground. But there are still many there, still operating. Some have had to go outside and to the United States or to Europe to operate more freely. But what I'm always impressed by is the presence of individuals such as Dalits, who actually have a number of international organizations. If they cannot, or some of their activities may be restricted in India on the ground, they still have other venues. And in fact, I think in the UN what we call special procedures, experts such as what I was, as special rapporteur, independent experts, we have 2 Dalits from India who actually are there. So they have a space, an ability, in fact, to be able to defend, to bring up and defend the issues around the rights of the Dalits and other minorities in ways that did not exist perhaps 20 years ago. There are also human rights groups that are based here in the United States that are trying to compensate for the repression that there is in India. Unfortunately, even some of them are being reached here in the United States. Mm-hmm. I think it's the United States Hindus for Human Rights. I think that's about the name of this organization. Apparently, they've been kicked out of X, formerly known as Twitter, through the pressure and the threats coming from the Indian government. But they're still very powerful voices, and they are trying to make sure that as much as there is extreme repression in India, the US government, others are aware of and hear of what is being done, what is occurring in India, how the various human rights issues, including of minorities, have to be kept in mind, have to be raised in terms of public awareness, but also amongst politicians here in the US. I do not think that there are enough members of Congress or House of Representatives that truly understand the scale of the repression of human rights in India. It is now amongst some of the worst offenders. It may be an ally, but when you have a friend, you don't lie to your friend. You don't let your friend steal from the neighbor or do evil things. And this is what I think needs to be highlighted. If you want India to be a true friend of India, you have to take it, the good and the bad, but you also have to respond to what is unacceptable morally and let it know that there are limits to what would be permissible.
Professor, you were going to say something?
I think I just wanted to finger on again, in terms of what we can do, is just the importance of Indian diaspora politics within the United States. And so I just want to draw your attention to the fact that in India's last Independence Day parade celebrated by Indian Americans in New Jersey, so a lot of this politics, a lot of this debate is playing out in the United States right now as the Indian American community becomes more and more important. And so as part of this parade was a bulldozer that one of my esteemed colleagues referenced, and the reason why the bulldozer was part of the Independence Day parade in New Jersey in the US on the 15th of August last year was because the bulldozer has become emblematic of the razing of Muslim homes. And so this, I forget exactly which town it was, I think it was New Brunswick or Edison.
Or Edison.
Edison. One of them in which the town hall debate was exactly about this. So a lot of this, as Indian American money, and as Indian Americans become more prominent, especially in certain pockets in the US, I think that you should keep an eye and a ear out to a lot of these debates that are playing out within these communities.
Yeah, I want to also bring up another movement that sprung from a grassroots organization, which is the Kisan, the farmers movement, which is resurgent again just in these last few weeks. And for those who haven't followed this particular story, there were some agricultural reforms introduced, and the country's farmers, primarily in the Punjab and North India, were not happy with these reforms, and so they mobilized a massive demonstration that lasted almost a year through the pandemic on the outskirts of Delhi, and they're back. And I just wanted to ask you both, I mean, this is, why in a context of repression and a crackdown on critics of all kinds, do you think the government has more or less permitted a mass mobilization of this kind to continue?
Do you think they've permitted it, Emily?
Well, they could respond in different ways. I think
the cost would be very high. I think I'm just in admiration of the Sikhs in general in terms of the role that they've played in Indian politics in many ways. But I think I'll spin the question a little and say that it's not a question of whether it's been allowed or permitted, but why has it arisen in the first place? And why is it so powerful? And why is it that they're back? And I think that tells us a lot about the economic situations for those who grow India's food. And thank you so much for mentioning it. I'm sorry that I omitted it, but I think this is a piece with the huge civil disobedience and resistance that we have seen to an increasingly repressive regime. And it's happening on a very different issue but it's happening by a very different set of people. I also just want to note, again, that this is the state of Punjab, which has had a very distinctive linguistic identity. Also, for many years, an active secessionist movement. I think, Fernand, you mentioned that there's this huge controversy about the killing of Khalistani leaders on Canadian and also potentially American and UK soil by India. And so that's also not unrelated to the politics of Punjab. But the politics of Punjab, again, are a politics of linguistic subnationalism.
So we're trying to get students on buses. So this will have to be a fast answer, but this is the question. Sir.
Yeah, I mainly have a question for Dr. de Varennes. You draw a very clear Uber narrative about what's going on in India. It's very clear from everything we've heard that these are dangerous times for Indian democracy. But when I look at the numbers on your slides, even though even one would be too many, they are relatively small numbers for a country of 1.4 billion. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the extent of the numbers of violence that you're talking about and the narrative that you're drawing. I just got back from India. I was there during the Pran Pratishtha, and there was a lot of exuberance on the part of people, a sense of pride. I hadn't been back in 12 years, and the sense of pride of people was really palpable, and it was hard not to get swept up into it. At the same time, remembering, my God, what would my Muslim friends be feeling today? And someone said to me years ago, India is a yes, but country. For every fact, there's a countervailing fact. So I'm getting a little bit nervous this afternoon that I feel like we're drawing very broad, deep brushstrokes, and there is so much going on in this very complex, large country. The DMK in Tamil Nadu, with what is going on there with industrialization and women in the workforce, is very different than Bihar. So do we run into danger by talking about India as just one India and not many? And do we bring our Western bias in getting so critical? Because you could take similar figures about this country and run from the room with your hair on fire. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I'm not following David's rules, but I wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That's a very, very good question. I think there's one thing, and it's true that if you look at some of those figures, those numbers, you may say, well, it's not very much considering the size of the country. But you have to add to that some other situations, the context that actually signal that those are actually the underrepresented numbers. There are a lot of people who are simply disappeared, particularly in places like Kashmir. We cannot know for sure if they've been executed or not, but it's very likely. There are situations where there have been extrajudicial killings or actually murders committed by paramilitary groups, so operating outside of the state apparatus as such. In other words, the numbers there are actually probably don't really represent the much higher scale of what is happening on the ground. I think that is where you have to be a bit cautious. But once again, most of the international organizations that look at situations of instability, potential conflicts, or mass killings quite clearly see that there is the official numbers and what's happening below those official numbers, and what is occurring under the surface seems to be extremely dangerous. And I would add that it's no accident that India has a number of violent conflicts. Kashmir is not finished. People may say it's peaceful, but in fact, scratch the surface, and that's not the reality on the ground. We have the situation in Manipur, which actually was extremely violent. There have been a number of incidents, including the destruction of the mosque in the early 1990s, where the Lord Ram temple is built, where there were about 2,000 people killed. So these numbers actually, one has to be careful, yes, but in reality, there is clearly indications that there are a large number of unreported situations, and that the situation is unstable, disturbing, in fact, in India, and extremely dangerous. So that's, I think, an important point that needs to be clear.
All right, so more late tomorrow when we have everybody up here on stage. There's some very patient bus drivers waiting for some of us. I know this has been like restaurant week where we're dining on like 12 courses every hour and a half, so I'll give you some time to digest, and we will see you tomorrow morning fresh at 9 o'clock. Thank you, and thank the panel.